Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're stepping quietly into a world lit by candlelight, a time when even sleep had rules. This is Victorian England, where every breath, every glance, every good night followed the silent choreography of etiquette.
Good night,
From
husband.
the way they brushed their hair exactly 100 times before bed, to the way they prayed without daring to feel too deeply, this world wasn't just lived, it was performed.
Lighten our darkness,
So,
we
before you
beseech
get
thee, O
comfortable,
Lord.
take
by
a
thy
gentle
great mercy,
moment to
defend
like
us
this
from all
video
perils
and subscribe. But only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, let the lights fade, and imagine the soft glow of a candle flickering in a quiet London room as we drift into the secret world of Victorian society rules you never knew. The morning in Victorian England did not arrive gently. It announced itself like a ritual. Outside, the fog lingered above cobblestone streets, swallowing the sound of carriage wheels and distant church bells. Inside the great houses, time itself obeyed a hierarchy. The wealthy often rose late, between 9 and 10, when the first sunlight filtered through heavy curtains embroidered with gold thread. But for the servants and the working poor, the day began in darkness. 5 o'clock, sometimes earlier, when the air still carried the chill of the night. A maid's first task was not to wash herself, but to light the fire for her mistress. Only
3
then,
layers,
when the
heavy
hearth
boots of
crackled
workers outside.
alive, could she dare to rinse her own face with cold water, because hot water was luxury reserved for the few. In those quiet hours, the entire class system of Britain could be heard in the rhythm of footsteps, heavy boots on the streets, soft slippers in the parlors, and bare feet on cold kitchen stone. In one London townhouse, a young maid named Clara was once dismissed simply for using her lady's warm water. It was for the roses, she said. But even flowers had rank in Victorian life. That small story, buried in a diary from 1874, reminds us that etiquette was not only about manners, it was about power. Meanwhile, upstairs, the lady of the house would finally stir. Servants entered silently, pulling aside the curtains with care. Mourning dresses, light fabrics, muted colors were laid out near the window. Dressing gowns for the first hour offered both modesty and grace. They were the armor of privacy before one faced the world. A proper Victorian morning was not chaotic, it was choreographed.
Factory whistle through
Each
the fog.
action, from washing to greeting, was a dance of restraint. Even water, the most ordinary element, carried meaning. Cold water cleansed not just the skin, but the soul. A symbolic start of purity for the day ahead. The wealthy had basins of porcelain trimmed in gold. The poor shared tin bowls by the hearth. Yet all bowed before the same belief. cleanliness was next to godliness. The city beyond was already alive.
The ritual
Newsboys
of restraint.
shouting headlines, factory whistles cutting through the fog. But inside the home, silence reigned. Children descended the stairs one by one, each pausing at the bottom step. They did not run to hug their parents, that would have been indecent. Instead, they bowed slightly, girls curtsying, boys inclining their heads. Respect was the first breakfast of the Victorian soul.
By the time the first clock in the hallway struck 9, breakfast had already transformed into ceremony. In a Victorian home, even the simple act of eating was laced with expectation. The dining room itself was a performance stage, mahogany tables gleaming like still water, silverware arranged with mathematical precision, and sunlight filtering through lace curtains like soft applause. The family entered not together, but in order. The father first, his presence setting the tone of the
Quiet
household.
London street.
Then the mother,
at night.
gliding in measured grace. Children followed in silence, their footsteps barely audible on the Persian rug. A maid pulled out chairs, each movement choreographed by habit and fear of error. Once seated, posture became a language. A straight back spoke of discipline. Slouching whispered disgrace. No elbows on the table, no hands resting idly. Knife in the right, fork in the left, movement small and deliberate. To speak while chewing was an unspoken sin. Even laughter was rationed. Too loud, and one risked appearing common. The aroma of toast and black tea filled the air.
A quiet
but
London
appetite
street
was secondary
at
to
night.
decorum. One lady of Mayfair once wrote that her husband took his breakfast in silence so devoutly that even the clock dared not tick. The Victorians believed that self-control at the table reflected moral virtue. A person who could master his knife and fork was believed capable of mastering his passions, his desires, his very soul. Yet, beneath this order, small rebellions stirred. In one country estate, a governess recorded how a young daughter once slipped marmalade onto her toast with her fingers instead of a spoon. The scandal was immediate. She was sent from the table in tears. But later that day, her mother secretly smiled, confessing to her sister, "She reminds me of myself before the world taught me to behave." Such moments reveal a truth often hidden behind Victorian lace, that etiquette, while suffocating, was also a mask to hide tenderness and rebellion. Behind every polished spoon lay a quiet ache for freedom. The servants, standing still near the walls,
Moral
watched
virtue
everything.
at the table.
They could not sit or speak, yet they witnessed more honesty in silence than those seated in comfort. They saw glances exchanged between husband and wife, the nervous tapping of a foot beneath the table, the weary sigh of a man already burdened by duty before the day had truly begun. For most families, breakfast was not just a meal, it was the first test of the day.
Entering
To fail
a
in
secret
posture,
world.
in timing, in tone, was to fail in respectability itself. And in the Victorian world, respectability was life's highest currency. When the final teacup
Children,
was set
the
down
fog is quite
and the
thick this
silverware
morning.
ceased
Perhaps
to chime,
it will clear by
the
noon.
house exhaled. Morning, with all its rituals, had come to an end. But for Victorians, the true performance
latest
was
news from the
only
continent.
about to
Read
begin.
the Tecupi.
Outside
War
those
declared.
tall
Get your
windows
evening suit and
where
dad here.
society itself waited
Read all
to
about
be
it.
watched.
Get your morning paper
Curtains
here.
parted like
Latest
stage
news from the
drapes,
city.
letting in the pale London
The Morning
sun.
Post. Read the
Through
latest
the
news.
misted
All
glass,
the details
a
here.
new day revealed its rhythm. Carriages rumbling over cobblestones, newspaper boys shouting the latest scandal, and ladies in pastel
There, the ribbons are
gowns
quite perfect now,
stepping
madam.
carefully
Excellent.
over puddles.
And these gloves are
their
finally
parasols
situated.
tilted
We mustn't
at
be late.
perfect angles.
Are my ribbons quite
In
right
the
for
drawing
morning
room,
call?
the lady
Indeed,
of the
they are
house
perfect.
adjusted her
We
gloves,
mustn't be late.
ensuring that each finger fit
Precisely
like
8
etiquette
bells.
itself.
Indeed.
Tight,
Morning is upon us.
precise,
Our compliments to the captain,
unyielding.
if you please.
Her morning dress was not chosen for comfort, but for communication. Every ribbon, every pearl whispered status. It was said that in Victorian England, one could read a person's virtue by the cleanliness of their
Fresh
cuffs.
roses,
Even
lovely
dust
roses
was moral.
here.
The
Get
butler
your
announced
morning
softly, "The carriage
Lovely
awaits."
roses for your lady, sir.
The
Fresh
family
this morning.
prepared to
Indeed,
venture
they are
into
quite
the
splendid.
world, a
I shall
world
take a
where
bunch.
eyes never stopped observing. Every gesture might echo at the next dinner party, every word become gossip
She has certainly
before
displeased
sunset.
the Duchess.
The Victorians
Look how
lived in
stern
glass
she is.
houses
I wonder
long
what she could have
before
done.
glass towers were built. Their greatest fear was not poverty or sin, but embarrassment. There is a curious entry in a 19th century journal of Lady Eleanor Finch, who confessed
A
that
lovely
one
loaf,
morning
thank you
she
kindly.
forgot to
That'll be
curtsy
6pence,
before
madam.
a visiting
Freshly
duchess.
baked this morning.
Her Grace's silence, she wrote,
Here is
was
your
more
loaf, ma'am.
terrifying
Warm
than
and
thunder.
fresh this morning.
Much
The
obliged,
entire
Master
household
Baker. It
felt the
smells
chill
heavenly.
of that
Freshly
mistake.
baked this morning,
Even the
ma'am.
servants
It
moved
smells
more
wonderful,
quietly
thank
that day.
you.
Look at the
A single
buns, they're
missed
enormous.
bow could
Here you are,
ruin
madam,
a
fresh from
season's
the oven.
reputation.
Thank you kindly, Baker. It smells
Etiquette
divine
was not
this
simply
foggy morning.
manners.
Look, Timothy,
it
the
was
gingerbread man.
survival. Yet amid the lace and restraint, there was beauty. The smell of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery. The faint perfume of lilacs carried by a passing breeze. The sparkle of sunlight on brass doorknobs polished by invisible hands. The world glowed with an order both comforting and cruel. As the carriage rolled away, children pressed their faces to the window, watching the city unfold. Chimneys breathing smoke, workers
lovely
marching
bouquet
like
for the
clock
lady this fine
hands,
morning.
and
Thank
street
you
sweepers
kindly.
bending
They
to
smell
clear
divine.
yesterday's dirt from today's dreams. Life moved in perfect symmetry, or so it seemed. But behind that illusion, London was splitting in two. Just a few streets away, women in tattered shawls stood in the fog, selling flowers or themselves. The same morning sun that gilded silver spoons also glinted on broken glass. The Victorian dream, for all its grace, carried a shadow. And so the day began again, under rules unwritten, under eyes unseen. For every bow, every polished shoe, every measured word, there was a cost. But in that world of constraint, some found peace in the pattern, like music too strict to dance to, yet strangely soothing.
The rhythm of
If you
perfection.
closed your eyes in a Victorian morning, you might hear it too. The steady rhythm of a civilization trying desperately to appear perfect. One curtsy, one teacup,
The rhythm
one
of
heartbeat
perfection.
at a time.
The sound of fabric brushing against fabric, soft, deliberate, endless, was the quiet symphony of every Victorian morning. Dressing was not a task, it was a ritual, a small act of worship to the god of appearance. The first layer was innocence itself, the chemise, a thin white garment against the skin, meant to protect both the dress and modesty. Then came the drawers, petticoats, crinolines, each layer whispering restraint, each tightening the distance between comfort and respectability. At the heart of it all lay the corset. To tighten it was to be reborn, painfully, beautifully. The ideal waist was no more than 20 inches, 18 for the truly enviable. Some women fainted before breakfast, others learned to breathe in sips, not breaths. Yet the smaller the waist, the greater the virtue, or so society claimed. A woman's moral character, they said, could be measured by how much she could endure. There was a story whispered in Bath of Lady Margaret Harcourt, whose corset was pulled so tightly one morning that she could not descend the stairs without assistance. At the grand luncheon that followed, her fainting spell was mistaken for refinement. "How graceful her weakness," murmured one guest. In the Victorian world, even suffering had to look elegant. Dressing was not done alone. Few women, except for the poorest, could manage it without help. A maid laced the corset from behind, pulling steadily, counting each breath. She had to know the line between beauty and damage, for one tug too many could crack a rib. Still, mistresses often demanded perfection, whispering through clenched teeth, "Tighter!" Once secured, the silhouette transformed. Shoulders back, chin high, the body became architecture, engineered elegance. Layers of silk, lace, and whalebone molded not just the figure, but the persona. The corset did not merely shape the waist, it shaped behavior. A woman who could not bend easily would not stoop to vulgarity, and that, perhaps, was the point. Outside, the streets of London hummed with the rhythm of commerce and carriages, but in every drawing room, women fought invisible wars against the cage beneath their gowns. Yet they smiled, for to be admired was to exist. Mirrors were not objects, they were altars, and each reflection was a quiet prayer to be seen, approved, remembered. By afternoon, the corset was no longer a burden, it was armor. Women moved through drawing rooms and manicured gardens as if gliding on strings of etiquette, every gesture rehearsed since girlhood. Fashion, to a Victorian, was not self-expression, but obedience. To look proper was to belong. Hair, above all, was a proclamation. No respectable lady appeared in public with her hair loose. That was the mark of a fallen woman, or worse, an actress. Instead, the hair was coiled, twisted, or braided high into architectural shapes that could take an hour or more to construct. One wrong pin could collapse an entire reputation. A London columnist in 1862 once wrote, "A lady's hair is her crown, yet her downfall, should it ever fall."
In truth, such words were not mere poetry, they were warning. There was a minor scandal that same year. Miss Caroline Spence, daughter of a merchant, attended a charity luncheon with her hair only half tied, a soft curl falling against her neck. By evening, the papers had called her careless and morally uncertain. Within a week, her engagement was quietly withdrawn. One misplaced strand could undo a lifetime of preparation. Gloves, too, were not mere accessories. They were barriers between flesh and judgment. To show one's bare hands was intimate, almost indecent. Gloves told stories. Their color whispered age. Their stitching whispered wealth. White gloves were for purity, gray for mourning, ivory for maturity. And heaven forbid a lady appear gloveless. She might as well have arrived barefoot. The hat completed the equation. It was both shield and signal. Bonnets for morning walks, plumed hats for afternoon visits, and delicate fascinators for soirees under candlelight. A milliner's shop was like a confessional booth, women revealing their desires in silk and feathers, then leaving with secrets perched upon their heads. The materials themselves spoke in coded dialects. Cotton was humble, silk was ambition, velvet was arrival. Color, too, declared allegiance, muted blues for discretion, burgundy for confidence, black for sorrow, white for virtue. But the brightest hues were reserved for the few who could afford to ignore modesty. In this visual world, everything communicated, even absence. Pockets, for instance, were absent on purpose. No respectable woman had them. To carry money or keys implied independence, and independence was unbecoming. Instead, small handbags called reticules dangled from wrists like ornamental chains. A woman might own a fortune in jewels, but not a single real pocket to hide her own coin. There was irony in every stitch, every rule. The more confined the body, the more society admired it. The more dependent the woman, the more she was called graceful. And yet, behind closed doors, some women laughed. They tied their corsets a little looser, let their hair fall after dusk, and felt, for a brief moment, what freedom might taste like.
As dusk settled over the city, the glow of gaslight painted gold across mirrors and lace. The ladies of the Victorian world prepared once again to transform. Morning dresses gave way to dinner gowns, lighter shades to darker elegance. The ritual repeated itself 3 or 4 times a day, each costume marking not time, but identity. To be well-dressed was not a matter of taste, it was survival. But beneath the shimmer of satin lay quiet peril. Fashion, in its devotion to perfection, sometimes turned cruel. The corset,
that symbol of discipline and virtue, was also an instrument of damage. Doctors of the time wrote of crushed ribs, misplaced organs, and fainting fits mistaken for grace. It was not uncommon for women to carry smelling salts in their handbags, tiny bottles of revival after beauty had stolen their breath. A newspaper in 1859 reported a tragic irony. A young woman in Bristol, famed for her flawless waist, collapsed during a ball. The report noted she was the envy of all present until she was carried out, pale as her pearls. Yet even such stories rarely slowed the obsession. Perfection demanded obedience, and so the ritual tightened again. Then came the crinoline, the vast cage of steel hoops worn beneath the skirt. It made a woman appear like a floating bell of grace, yet it was treacherous. Its circumference could span 6 feet, its weight nearly 15 pounds. In crowded rooms, crinolines knocked over vases, toppled candles, and trapped their wearers in doorways. There were even tales of women blown into ponds by sudden gusts of wind. One notorious story spread through London in 1863. A lady attending the opera brushed too close to a fireplace. Her crinoline caught flame, the silk igniting faster than she could scream. Despite frantic attempts to smother it, she died within minutes. The papers called it a tragedy of fashion, though the world went on buying dresses just the same. Behind these tragedies hid an unspoken truth. Beauty in the Victorian world was a form of endurance, a quiet contest between flesh and fabric. To suffer beautifully was to belong. To breathe freely was to be forgotten. Yet there were whispers of rebellion. Some women began to question the rules. They read pamphlets from the Rational Dress Society, calling for looser garments and freedom from the corset's tyranny. A healthy woman, one writer claimed, is more graceful than a strangled one. The movement was small, but its echo lingers even now. In every sigh of relief when we loosen a belt, and every quiet act of choosing comfort over control. The Victorians, for all their constraints, left behind a paradox. They showed the world how powerfully beauty could rule and how deeply it could wound. As night settled upon their gaslit streets, mirrors once again reflected perfect silhouettes, hiding the breathless truths beneath. In the silence of the evening, one might almost hear the rustle of silk, the soft gasp of a woman tightening her corset for dinner, and wonder if she too dreamed of freedom.
In Victorian England, a visit was never merely a visit. It was an exchange, a delicate transaction in the grand economy of reputation. The currency was not gold or silver, but paper. A small rectangular calling card engraved with a name and nothing more.
These cards were the passwords to society, the silent language of belonging. Every respectable household kept a silver tray near the front door, where visitors left their cards. The number, placement, and condition of those cards said more about a family than any conversation could. A card bent at the corner might signal personal acquaintance. One folded lengthwise suggested a visit of condolence. To ignore a card was to reject an alliance. The ritual was meticulous. A lady would never arrive unannounced. Visits were permitted only between the hours of 3 and 5 in the afternoon, the golden hours of polite intrusion. To call at any other time was an offense, an intrusion upon private dignity. A proper guest would descend from her carriage with gloved hands, hand the butler her card on a small silver salver, and wait in silence. The servant would carry the card to the lady of the house, who decided within moments whether the caller was to be received or quietly turned away. It was a game of presence and absence. Who saw whom? Who ignored whom? And who had the privilege of being remembered? One social columnist of 1870 compared it to chess. The pawns are invitations, the queens are reputations, and a single wrong move may checkmate a season. For new brides, the game was crueler still. A newly married woman could not pay calls until others called upon her first, a silent test of her husband's standing. If no one came, she could wait weeks, even months, trapped in a cage of courtesy. One diary tells of Mrs. Eliza Morton, who waited every afternoon beside her window, dressed in lavender silk, her tray empty. "I have taken tea with my reflection," she wrote. "Society has not yet called upon me." And so the drawing rooms of London pulsed with invisible tension, an orchestra of expectation playing behind every knock at the door. A misplaced card, a mistimed visit could end a friendship or ruin a name. In a world obsessed with decorum, even arrival required permission. Outside, carriages lined the streets like clockwork, each bearing its passengers of politeness. The city seemed still, yet beneath the lace and lamplight, an unspoken network thrived. Favors traded, names remembered, alliances renewed. The art of visiting was not about company, it was about consequence. Once the servant opened the door and the visitor was admitted, another performance began. The drawing room was not a room, it was a stage. Every chair, every gesture, every second was part of a choreography designed to preserve hierarchy. A guest never sat until invited. never placed herself on the central sofa unless she outranked the hostess. To choose the wrong chair was to choose the wrong identity. The lady of the house sat slightly elevated, often near the window, light falling upon her like a halo. Her guests arranged themselves in order of social gravity, orbiting her like planets around the sun. Conversation was the gravity that held them together, and silence the abyss that could swallow anyone unprepared. Time itself was etiquette. A visit longer than 20 minutes was presumptuous, shorter than 15, dismissive. To overstay was to declare oneself ignorant of refinement. There is a note in an 1881 etiquette manual that reads, "In polite society, absence is sometimes the truest form of respect." And so, people learned to leave before warmth turned into weariness. Tea was served, but rarely drunk. Cups rested gracefully in gloved hands, a symbol of self-control. The clink of porcelain was the only sound allowed to break the still air. Questions were mild, compliments measured. To speak of weather was safe. To mention politics was reckless. To reveal emotion was vulgar. It was a world where words existed not to express, but to impress. And yet, even in such precision, errors could bloom like scandalous flowers. One spring afternoon in 1875, Mrs. Henrietta Blakemore overstayed her visit at Lady Weatherby's home by almost 40 minutes. The reason, it seemed, was harmless. She was telling an amusing story about her husband's new horse. But etiquette had its own arithmetic. Every extra minute tilted the balance. The following day, whispers spread through Mayfair. She speaks too long and listens too little. Within weeks, her invitations dwindled. The rules were invisible, but merciless. Even the act of saying goodbye was bound by hierarchy. The hostess rose first only if she wished to end the meeting. If the guest stood prematurely, it was an insult, implying the conversation had bored her. In some homes, there was even a bell to signal that the proper time had elapsed. The soft chime did not startle, it reminded. Such delicacy gave rhythm to society's heartbeat. To watch it now from a distance feels both absurd and mesmerizing. A world that mistook composure for kindness and formality for virtue. But within its narrow codes, the Victorians found certainty. In an age trembling with change, etiquette was their anchor, rigid, glittering, and unyielding.
In Victorian England, entire weeks revolved around a strange calendar, the at-home days. Each lady of standing would choose one afternoon per week to receive visitors, and her calling card would bear the sacred words, "At home, Thursdays 3 to 5. On that day, her drawing room became a crossroads of alliances and ambitions, where the air smelled of perfume, politics, and polished teacups. These visits were never spontaneous. They were carefully plotted across town like constellations of obligation. To arrive on the wrong day was not just inconvenient, it was humiliating. A misplaced visit meant one had failed to keep track of society's invisible map. There's a note in the London Evening Chronicle from 1869 describing a most unfortunate incident. A colonel's wife who called on Lady Pembroke on a Tuesday instead of Friday. The servants turned her away at the door, and within days the gossip spread faster than ink. If she cannot read a card, what else can she not read? The at-home ritual reflected something deeper, the geometry of class. The higher your rank, the fewer calls you made, and the more calls you received. Power was measured not in words, but in who had to knock. The lower classes orbited politely, trying to be seen without seeming desperate. Even the act of sending flowers afterward could tilt social balance. A bouquet of roses meant respect, orchids, intimacy. And then there were the scandals, those tiny social earthquakes that shook the city's calm veneer. One such story came from Kensington in 1884. Mrs. Alice Drummond, newlywed and eager to impress, sent out cards announcing her own at-home before receiving any visits herself. It was a breach of etiquette so subtle, yet so catastrophic, that the newspapers dubbed it the premature reception. Invitations were withdrawn, acquaintances vanished, and her husband's business suffered for a year. In the hierarchy of appearances, even enthusiasm was a sin. But not every misstep ended in ruin. There are letters from that same period, softly defiant, quietly human, written by women who dared to question the ritual. One wrote, "If friendship must be timed, it is no longer friendship." Another confessed, "I keep my door open to those who knock without fear." Still, most continued to play the game, not out of vanity, but out of necessity. The web of etiquette was both prison and protection. To ignore it was to fall. To master it was to survive. As twilight dimmed the lamps along London streets, the city itself seemed to exhale. Inside parlors, calling cards were gathered, sorted, sometimes burned. Alliances had been reinforced, boundaries redrawn, reputations polished like silver. The day's theater was over, and in that fading quiet, one could almost hear the rustle of skirts and paper, the faint clatter of carriage wheels fading into the dusk, a civilization whispering to itself, "I am still seen, therefore I exist." There was an hour every afternoon when the empire itself seemed to pause. Factories still roared, trains still ran, but within parlors and drawing rooms across Britain, time softened. It was 4 o'clock, tea time. The ritual was so ingrained, so revered, that to skip it was almost an act of rebellion. For the Victorians, tea was not just a beverage, it was civilization in a cup. The ceremony began with precision. The hostess sat at the center of the table, framed by lace curtains and soft light. A silver teapot gleamed like a relic, surrounded by scones, sponge cakes, and cucumber sandwiches cut with surgical neatness. The clink of porcelain was the heartbeat of the room. To pour tea was to perform an art. The hostess always served her guests first, ensuring each cup was filled 2/3, never more. To spill was humiliation. To pour unevenly was moral failure.
Even the act of holding a cup carried the weight of centuries. The correct way, thumb and index finger gently on the handle, middle finger beneath for support. Never hook your finger through, never raise your pinky. It was considered childish, a relic of affectation. The cup must remain poised, steady, as though even gravity obeyed decorum. Conversation flowed as gently as the tea itself. It was the one social ritual where formality softened but never disappeared. Compliments were exchanged like sugar cubes, sweet but measured. Laughter existed but quietly. The sound of mirth could never rise above the sound of spoons. To laugh loudly at tea was to let the barbarian in. There is a charming but true anecdote of a tea party in Bath, circa 1878. A young lady, newly returned from India, lifted her cup and accidentally let out a bright, hearty laugh at a story about a clumsy suitor. The room froze. Even the teapot seemed to stop steaming. She tried to apologize, but the hostess merely smiled, a small, brittle curve of the lips. The next week, no one called upon her again. A single laugh had made her unfit for polite society. For the Victorians, tea was sacred precisely because it demanded restraint. It reminded them that manners were the last defense against chaos. In the swirl of sugar and steam, there was order, and in that order, peace. Outside, carriages rattled and the sky dimmed to amber. Inside, the tea cooled slowly, untouched for long stretches, as though what truly mattered was not the taste, but the appearance of calm. In that small circle of china and conversation, the empire maintained its illusion of grace, one careful sip at a time.
Dinner in the Victorian era was not a meal, it was theater. The table glittered beneath candlelight, silver polished to blindness, crystal glasses aligned with military precision. Yet beneath all that brilliance lay an invisible tension, for every guest was both performer and judge. The rules of dining were a labyrinth, and one misstep could echo across drawing rooms for weeks. Seating itself was an art form. The host and hostess sat opposite each other, commanding the table like conductors of decorum. To their right were the guests of honor, the order descending like ripples in a pond, ranked by title, wealth, and subtle politics. To be placed too far from the host was a quiet humiliation, a reminder that one's importance had dimmed. The first course arrived, soup, simple yet treacherous. The correct method was sacred, spoon away from oneself, never toward. The edge of the spoon touched lips only to pour, never to enter the mouth. Slurping was a sin. Wiping the mouth with the napkin was forbidden. One must dab gently with a handkerchief carried discreetly. Even the act of eating demanded moral restraint. Knives, forks, and spoons formed an orchestra of manners. There was a right utensil for each dish: oysters, fish, game, pudding, and to reach for the wrong one was a confession of ignorance. One young gentleman, recorded in a diary from 1871, once cut his fruit with the wrong knife during a banquet at Blenheim. The hostess's expression did not change, but afterward his name disappeared from her guest list. In London, a single slip of the wrist could exile you from society. Conversation was as carefully measured as the courses themselves. One spoke between bites, never during. Politics and religion were forbidden.
Compliments to the hostess were obligatory. A story too long risked boredom, too short risked indifference. It was said that a well-bred dinner is eaten in silence and remembered in gratitude. And through it all, laughter was dangerous. A restrained smile was elegance. A visible tooth was vulgarity. To laugh too loudly at the table was to reveal appetite, not for food, but for attention. There is a rather tragic anecdote of Lady Frances Pembroke, who once let out a genuine laugh during a dinner party after a witty remark from a poet guest. The table fell silent. Her husband, mortified, dropped his napkin as though severing ties. For months, caricatures of the laughing lady circulated in illustrated papers, her joy immortalized as ridicule. The paradox of Victorian dining was that it disguised hunger beneath performance. The more graceful the gesture, the less real the experience. They ate, but not to be nourished. They dined to be seen. And in that silent symphony of clinking glass and polite restraint, civilization convinced itself that control was the highest form of beauty.
As twilight deepened, the true spectacle of Victorian society began: the dinner party. It was the crown jewel of etiquette, a performance of elegance, endurance, and hidden judgment. Invitations were handwritten on thick ivory paper, and to receive one from a notable family was both an honor and a test. A grand dinner could last 2, sometimes 3 hours. The menu unfolded like a poem in 12 verses. Oysters to awaken, consommé to cleanse, fish to balance, game to impress, pudding to soothe, fruit to conclude. Between courses came the pauses, those delicate silences when servants glided like ghosts, replacing plates without sound. Even silence had rhythm. Certain foods carried secrets of status. Turtle soup, once reserved for the aristocracy, was served as proof of wealth. Quail signaled refinement. Beef, modest prosperity. Eating with gusto was taboo. Appetite had to be disguised beneath grace. One might starve politely, but never appear greedy. The choreography of the meal extended to its smallest gestures. Guests unfolded napkins simultaneously, waited for the hostess to lift her fork before touching theirs. Wine was poured by servants only. To refill one's own glass was scandalous. Bread was never bitten, only broken. Even fruit obeyed geometry, peeled in perfect spirals, cut in silent symmetry. There was an infamous dinner at Lord Ellington's estate in 1868 that London gossips would whisper about for years. A visiting French baron, unfamiliar with English customs, made the error of using his fruit knife as one would a regular blade, cutting too deeply, scraping the silver plate. The sound was sharp, metallic, unforgettable. Conversation froze. The hostess smiled tightly, the candlelight trembling on her rings. Within a week, caricatures appeared in society papers mocking the barbarous baron. It took 2 seasons before he was invited anywhere again. These were not meals, but examinations.
To dine was to prove one's breeding, to reveal one's education without speaking a word. Every bite was a sentence, every pause a paragraph. To err, even in grace, was to be rewritten out of society's book. And yet, for all their rigidity, the Victorians sought beauty in control. There was comfort in knowing exactly when to lift a spoon, when to smile, when to stand. It gave the illusion that life itself could be tamed, that chaos could be spooned and sipped away like consommé. As the final course arrived, perhaps a delicate syllabub or a molded jelly that trembled under the chandelier, the room shimmered with quiet exhaustion. Servants moved slower. Conversation softened to murmurs. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass. Inside, the illusion of perfection held, fragile as sugar lace. When at last the hostess rose, signaling the end, the guests stood in unison. They had survived another evening of civilization's most demanding theater. In their silence lay both pride and fatigue, the knowledge that beauty in their world was never effortless. It was earned, one restrained gesture at a time.
Love in the Victorian era was a paradox, both sacred and supervised. To fall in love was to enter a labyrinth of rules, where every glance, every letter, every touch had meaning. Passion existed, but only behind layers of propriety. For those born under lace and lamplight, romance was less a fire than a candle, contained, trembling, but never allowed to burn freely. No gentleman could address a lady by her first name unless an engagement had been formally announced. Until then, names were fences, polite barriers that kept desire at bay. Miss Fairfax might mean affection. Margaret would mean scandal. The simplest word could become a whisper of impropriety. Courtship was a public secret. Every meeting required a chaperone, usually a mother, aunt, or formidable governess who watched with the precision of a hawk. Parks, promenades, drawing rooms, even church pews were arenas of supervision. A gentleman might admire a lady's hat, but never her hair. He could offer his arm over a puddle, but not his hand. Skin to skin was forbidden. Gloves were the armor of decency. Yet the Victorians, with all their restraint, were ingenious in the language of secrecy. Lovers developed a silent vocabulary that society could not hear. The most famous was the language of the fan. A lady could signal her emotions through subtle gestures. Drawing the fan slowly across her cheek meant, "I love you." Snapping it shut meant, "We are being watched." And letting it rest on her left hand was a promise to wait. There is a story from 1876 about a young governess named Clara and her employer's son, Edward. Their affection was unspoken, but visible to anyone with eyes, though, of course, no one dared to speak of it. During a summer garden party, Clara accidentally dropped her fan. Edward retrieved it, but instead of returning it at once, he brushed the edge of it lightly against his glove before placing it back. To the guests, it was nothing. To them, it was a confession. Within weeks, Clara was dismissed for reasons of impropriety. Edward was sent to the continent for refinement. Their romance ended before a single word had been exchanged. Such was love under the rule of decorum, whispered, coded, doomed to discretion. And yet, in its secrecy, it gained an intensity that modern hearts rarely know. The Victorians learned to love through absence, to speak through silence. In their world, longing was the purest form of devotion.
So, if the language of fans was for the eyes, then the language of letters was for the soul. In Victorian England, a love letter was not just ink and paper. It was a declaration of identity, sealed with discretion and trembling hands. To write to someone of the opposite sex was a bold act. To do so without a guardian's knowledge was reckless, perhaps ruinous. The stationery itself spoke volumes. Only ivory paper was proper, never colored, never perfumed, for scent suggested intimacy. Handwriting was expected to be delicate, yet legible. Emotion must never spill beyond the margins. Every fold was symbolic. Folded once meant friendship. Twice meant affection. Thrice meant devotion. A wax seal broken by anyone but the intended reader was social catastrophe. The Victorians treated letters as living things, dangerous, tender, and permanent. One such story whispered through parlors was that of Miss Eleanor Pritchard, whose secret correspondence with a naval officer was discovered by her maid. Within days, rumors spread across Brighton. The letters, 23 in all, were said to have been written on scented paper, her initials pressed in lilac wax. The scandal was not the affection, but the audacity. She was never married. Yet, even under scrutiny, love found ways to move, to dance, literally. In the grand ballrooms of Mayfair, courtship unfolded not in words but in waltzes. The waltz was new, daring, and dangerously intimate. For the first time, a man's hand rested on a woman's waist. Their eyes might actually meet. To dance was to trespass the borders of propriety under the guise of music. It was said that in 1854, at the Duchess of Devonshire's winter ball, a young woman fainted mid-waltz after realizing her partner had whispered, barely audible, "Your hand fits perfectly." It caused an uproar, not for the fainting, but for the whisper. Newspapers debated for weeks whether waltzing should be banned as erotically perilous. Moralists called it a slow fall from grace. Gloves, of course, were mandatory, thin barriers between temptation and touch. If a gentleman removed his glove before offering a hand, it was more than impolite. It was intimate. There were cases where a lady's parents, upon witnessing such a gesture, ended the acquaintance instantly. The Victorians feared proximity because it reminded them how human they truly were. Yet, beneath the layers of fabric and fear, There pulsed an undeniable truth that love, though restrained, refused to disappear. In letters written in careful ink and in dances timed to orchestral grace, hearts found their way to one another, briefly, bravely, and often too late.
When love survived long enough to be spoken aloud, it had to pass through ceremony. A Victorian proposal was less a moment of passion than a performance of permission. A gentleman could never propose directly to the lady he loved. First, he had to seek the blessing of his father, an audience often more terrifying than romance itself. The question, "May I have your daughter's hand?" was less about love and more about lineage, income, and suitability. Only when the father agreed could the suitor approach the daughter, and even then, never alone. The act of proposing was steeped in ritual. There were no rings at first, only words. Rings came later, after acceptance, often adorned with pearls for purity or small diamonds for endurance. To kneel was optional, but sincerity was not. And once she said yes, life entered a new chapter of observation. Engagements were meant to last between 6 months to a year, long enough for propriety to ensure the couple's patience and society to test their compatibility. The engaged pair could walk together, but always under supervision. Letters were now allowed, though still inspected by family. They might exchange locks of hair, photographs, or pressed flowers, tokens of affection that replaced physical touch. In this world, sentiment was safer than skin. But not all engagements ended in church bells. Many dissolved quietly under the weight of expectation. A broken engagement, however, was scandalous for the woman, not the man. It was said that a gentleman regains his freedom, but a lady never regains her reputation. A love that faltered became her shame to carry. There is a melancholy story of Miss Adelaide Munro, whose fiancé, Captain Greaves, sailed for India 6 months before their wedding. He wrote faithfully for a year, then silence. Rumors whispered that he had died of fever. Others said he'd married abroad. Adelaide never sought another suitor. Each Sunday, she walked alone by the pier wearing pale lavender, the color of half-mourning. When she died in 1902, her letters were found neatly tied with blue ribbon, unopened after his last. The Victorians lived in a world where emotion was caged but never extinguished. Love was patient because it had no other choice. They learned to wait, to hope, to ache in silence. And in that waiting, they gave love a strange kind of immortality. As the night deepened, carriages faded down misty streets, and the sound of church bells carried through the fog. Behind lace curtains, a lady sat by her window, her gloves still on, her fan folded shut, whispering to herself words she could never say aloud. In that quiet, love still breathed, polite, invisible, eternal. In Victorian England, conversation was never simply conversation. It was architecture, each sentence a column, each pause a doorway. One spoke
not to reveal oneself, but to remain properly concealed. The greatest compliment a guest could receive after an evening of dialogue was not "how charming you are," but "how very proper." There were rules, of course, hundreds of them, unwritten yet universally obeyed. Topics were the borders of civility. The weather was safe. Art and literature acceptable. Music even delightful. But money, politics, and religion were landmines waiting beneath the carpet of politeness. To mention health was nearly as bad. It implied frailty, and frailty was indecorous. A lady might faint, but she must never discuss why. A proper conversation was a dance of distance. Voices low, tones even, eyes never held too long. To look directly into another's gaze for more than a heartbeat was an intrusion, a violation of invisible space. A well-bred lady was expected to look slightly away, as though every word cost a breath of modesty. Even laughter was rationed. A soft smile could adorn a remark, but a loud laugh, especially one that revealed teeth, was unbecoming. Emotion, wrote one etiquette author, is the garment of the unrefined. One must wear reason instead. And so, the parlors of England echoed not with joy, but with polite murmurs, like the whispering of silk. There is an amusing yet telling story from 1862 about Lord Witheringham, who scandalized an entire dinner by making a joke about coal prices. It was not the content, but the context. Money had entered the room. His hostess, quick to mend the breach, raised her glass and said sweetly, "How fortunate we are, my lord, that humor remains untaxed." The laughter that followed was soft, but the message was clear. Even wit must bow to decorum. Beneath such restraint lay a strange intimacy. Words, when rare, became precious. To share a genuine opinion was to share a piece of one's soul. The Victorians, for all their reserve, understood something we often forget: that silence can be seductive, and that the calmest conversation can hide the fiercest thoughts. In the Victorian world, words could build ladders or dig graves. Nowhere was this truer than in the delicate matter of titles. To address someone incorrectly was not a minor error, it was social suicide. Every title, Mr., Mrs., Miss, Lady, Lord, or Sir, carried invisible weight, a code that revealed exactly where one stood in the grand hierarchy of manners. To drop a title too soon was presumption. To withhold it too long was insult. Among equals, Mr. and Mrs. were safe. Miss denoted youth and respectability, but only if the lady was unmarried. To call a married woman Miss was to erase her status. To call an unmarried one Mrs. was to invent a scandal. The nobility existed on another plane altogether. Lady, Lord, Your Grace, Your Ladyship, each had to be deployed with surgical precision, lest one be whispered about at supper for weeks.
It was said that in 1881, a well-meaning American visitor addressed the Duchess of Portland simply as Madam. The silence that followed was legendary. Someone later wrote, "You could hear the chandelier judging her." The visitor was not invited again. Such were the stakes of speech. But more treacherous than titles was tone. The Victorians valued understatement above all things. To raise one's voice in public was to admit to chaos within. A lady's tone should flow like calm water. A gentleman's words should sound measured, never hurried, never loud. Even enthusiasm was rationed. Exclamation, one etiquette manual warned, is the refuge of the unrefined. It created a society where emotion itself became a dialect, spoken only through suggestion. A pause could mean approval, a tilt of the head, disapproval, a single raised brow, the death of conversation. The English gift for irony was not born of humor, it was born of repression. And yet, behind the polished words and careful tones, people longed to speak freely. Diaries from the period are full of confessions about this fatigue. One lady wrote, "I am tired of talking as though I were porcelain." Another, "Sometimes I wish to say what I mean and not what I must." Their voices never rose, but their pens trembled. In this world, a conversation could end reputations, but silence could save them. To speak was a risk. To choose each word was an act of survival. In a world where words were rationed and emotions suppressed, the Victorians became fluent in silence. Conversation did not end when speech stopped. It merely shifted into another language, the subtle lexicon of glances, gestures, and pauses. To survive in polite society was to master this art of unspoken understanding. A lady's fan, her gloves, even the angle of her head spoke for her. To rest her fan lightly against her lips could mean curiosity. To fold it closed signaled dismissal. A gentleman's posture, too, was a sentence. Leaning forward a fraction showed respect. Crossing his arms was arrogance. The drawing room was a stage of invisible dialogue, where every movement carried intent. Eye contact, though dangerous, was powerful. A moment too brief, and one seemed cold. A moment too long, and one invited ruin. There was famously the 7-second scandal of 1873, when a young barrister named Henry Latham was said to have looked into Lady Wexford's eyes for an indecent span of time during a charity ball. No words passed, but by morning the city whispered, "They have an understanding." By the week's end, Henry had fled to Scotland for reflection, and Lady Wexford retired to her country estate, her husband in ill health. All born of 7 seconds of honesty. The danger lay not only in what was said, but in what was felt too visibly. To blush was to confess. To sigh too deeply was indulgent. Even compassion could be misread as intimacy. A lady was trained to smile without warmth, to listen without leaning, to speak without revealing. The ideal conversation partner was a mirror, bright, polite, and without depth. Yet, curiously, this restraint bred a new intimacy. When one cannot speak freely, even the smallest gesture becomes charged with meaning. A shared glance across a dinner table, a pause before a farewell. These were the Victorians' love letters written in air. They lived in a world where what was unsaid mattered most. Modern eyes may see them as repressed, but perhaps they were simply deliberate. Their silence was not emptiness, it was craft. They believed that by containing emotion, they gave it shape. Like a sculptor chiseling marble, they revealed feeling by limiting it. In that discipline lay their version of beauty. As night fell over London's gaslit streets, drawing rooms dimmed and the last conversations of the evening melted into quiet, only the ticking of clocks and the soft rustle of silk remained. And somewhere in that hush, among thoughts left unspoken and glances half returned, the Victorians continued their eternal dialogue, graceful, controlled, and profoundly human.
As twilight descended upon Victorian England, the day did not end, it transformed. The gas lamps outside hissed softly, and behind lace curtains, households prepared for one of the most carefully choreographed rituals of the age, the evening. To dine, to converse, to display refinement, these were not merely pleasures but performances in miniature. A dinner invitation was both honor and test. The host's silver gleamed like moonlight. The servants rehearsed every motion, and the seating plan, oh, the seating plan, was a work of diplomacy. One did not simply sit where one pleased. The distance from the host determined one's rank, and the closer you were to the head of the table, the greater your social worth. Married couples never sat together. That would imply they had nothing new to say. Instead, they were separated to encourage fresh conversation. The first rule of dinner conversation: it must never be about food. The second, it must never last longer than the wine. Each course came with its rhythm: a soup for politeness, a roast for wit, a dessert for subtle flirtation. Napkins rested upon laps like quiet promises. To lift one before the hostess did was a breach. To leave it stained was a sin. After the final spoon was set down, there came the gentle moment of division. The ladies withdrew. With a soft rustle of silk and lace, they rose as one, curtsied to the host, and disappeared into the drawing room. The gentlemen remained, surrounded by cigar smoke and port wine. There, talk shifted from art to empire, from poetry to profit. To leave too early was weakness, to stay too long, vulgarity. The air was thick with tobacco and ambition. Meanwhile, beyond the oak doors, the women's world resumed in quiet harmony. Music, embroidery, conversation. The sound of a piano drifting down the corridor became the pulse of the house. A lady's fingers upon the keys were expected to charm, but not dazzle. Skill without passion was the rule. To play too well was to risk impropriety. Emotion was always suspect. There is a diary from 1879 that describes a dinner gone wrong in the most Victorian of ways. A young baronet, slightly drunk on port, broke into laughter during grace. The hostess fainted. The candles were snuffed, in mourning for manners. By the next morning,
Every house in Bath had heard. He left for India within the week. The Victorians lived by the belief that decorum, like daylight, should fade gently. As night deepened, so too did their restraint. Every hour after dusk was a negotiation between pleasure and propriety, a dance between who they were and who they must appear to be.
Once the dinner table had emptied and the men's cigars burned low, the true theater of the Victorian night began, the drawing room. There, beneath the soft glow of candles, society played its gentlest games. No one spoke loudly, and no laughter dared echo too far. Pleasure, like everything else in this age, required restraint. The ladies gathered first. Some took up embroidery, their needles flashing like tiny stars. Others sat at the piano, playing melodies by Mendelssohn or Chopin. Never Wagner, for he was considered too passionate. The harp was a favorite, its notes floating like gold dust in the air. The violin, however, was taboo. Its posture was thought indelicate, the curve of the arm too suggestive. Books were read aloud, but only from those deemed appropriate. A father might choose Dickens, a daughter might read poetry, but never a sensation novel. Such books, full of crimes, passions, and murders, were whispered about as moral contagion. One lady in Manchester was said to have fainted after reading Lady Audley's Secret. The physician prescribed fresh air and sermons. For entertainment, families turned to parlor games. Charades was a favorite, where gestures replaced words and laughter became a safe rebellion. Another was tableau vivant, living pictures, where guests posed silently to recreate famous paintings by candlelight. The scene might show an angel, a knight, or a scene from Shakespeare. To hold still for 5 minutes under the tremble of candle flames was to become art itself. Yet, as the century deepened, another fashion swept through parlors: séances. The Victorians, obsessed with both progress and the afterlife, sought to speak with the dead between spoonfuls of pudding. Curtains were drawn, hands were joined, and the room fell into reverent quiet. The table trembled, a candle flickered, and someone whispered, "Is anyone there?" The most famous séance of 1888 took place at the home of Mrs. Amelia Finch, a widow who claimed to contact her late husband. 20 guests attended, half left pale. One journal wrote, "It is a curious age when science and spirits dine together." But these gatherings were not rebellion, they were release. In a world ruled by etiquette, the séance offered something thrilling, a space where emotion, wonder, even fear could exist without censure. For an hour, the Victorians could tremble, laugh, or believe, and blame it on the supernatural. Beyond the candles, the housekeeper ensured that the lights were never too bright. Illumination in Victorian taste was meant to flatter modesty. Harsh light was vulgar. It revealed too much. Shadows were elegance.
And so every night in that age ended not in brilliance, but in half-darkness, a soft, golden gloom where everything unsaid could safely live. As the evening drew to its close, the great houses of England softened into quiet rhythm. The last notes of piano music faded. The parlor doors creaked gently shut, and the hour of farewells arrived. In the Victorian world, even saying goodbye was a ceremony. Guests stood as the host and hostess rose. There were no hugs, no effusive handshakes, only a slight bow for gentlemen, and a gloved hand extended with grace for ladies. To say too much at parting was vulgar. The proper farewell was brief, polite, and free of emotion. "It was most agreeable" was a phrase that carried all the warmth society allowed. At the door, the host accompanied guests to the threshold, but never beyond it. To step outside was considered servile. The hostess might wave a lace handkerchief from the doorway, the candlelight trembling in her hand. As carriages rolled away into the fog, their wheels whispered over cobblestones, carrying gossip and gratitude in equal measure. Inside, the house grew dimmer. Lamps were turned down, not out. Complete darkness was considered improper, but bright light, vulgar. Candles burned in silver holders until the wax ran thin, then were gently snuffed. Shadows lengthened upon velvet curtains, and the world seemed to exhale. In the nursery, children knelt beside their beds, whispering prayers memorized since infancy. In grander homes, even servants gathered for a short devotion. Family prayers led by the master of the house. Voices murmured like distant wind, asking for peace through the night and dignity in the morning. Faith was not separate from etiquette. It was part of it. By 10 or 11 o'clock, the city had settled into its ordered silence. Gentlemen retreated to their chambers, sometimes pausing to read the day's newspaper or write a letter sealed with wax. Ladies brushed their hair exactly 100 strokes before bed, an act both hygienic and meditative. Corsets were loosened, jewels removed, and the world of appearances dissolved into candlelight. In these last moments, the Victorians returned to something rare in their waking hours: stillness. No one rushed. Even fatigue was measured. Sleep, to them, was not escape. It was another ritual of control. One might say they never truly rested, only performed repose. Outside, The fog of London thickened over the River Thames, muffling the city's heartbeat. From behind every shuttered window came the same gentle hush, the end of another perfectly proper day. And if a stray candle still flickered somewhere past midnight, it was not rebellion, it was longing, quietly disguised as light. When the last lamp in the parlor was dimmed and the footsteps in the corridor faded, the Victorians began their final and most intimate ritual, preparing for bed. But even this quiet moment was governed by decorum. To the Victorian mind, rest was not an escape from duty. It was duty done gracefully. In the bedroom, the world of propriety followed one inside. A maid entered first, her steps soft as breath, to prepare the fire or fetch warm water in a porcelain basin. A gentleman's night began with the loosening of his collar, the unbuttoning of waistcoat and cuff, every gesture deliberate, composed. His wife, in another chamber, would be assisted by her lady's maid, her corset unlaced with the precision of ritual. The garments of the night were themselves symbols of modesty. Men wore long nightshirts of cotton or linen, sometimes with small monograms stitched near the breast. Women donned flowing nightgowns trimmed with lace and ribbons. The infamous nightcap tied neatly under the chin. To remove the cap before sleep was considered careless. One must remain presentable, even to dreams. A curious detail survives from a London household manual of 1868. No lady of refinement shall ever appear in her night attire without a wrapper or shawl, should she be unexpectedly summoned. The imagination drifts. What emergencies did they anticipate at midnight? Perhaps the cat, perhaps the ghosts of decorum itself. Before retiring, there was the ritual of the hair. A lady's hair was her crown, and to maintain it demanded discipline. Each night, it must be brushed exactly 100 times, no more, no less. The strokes, counted in rhythm, were said to calm the mind and distribute the natural oils. One diary from 1872 confides, "By the 50th stroke, my worries begin to untangle. By the 100th, I am nearly at peace." Even the bed obeyed its geometry. The most proper alignment was north to south, believed to balance the body's magnetism with the earth's. To sleep facing east was to invite unrest, to face west, indulgence. And so, with compasses in drawers and superstition in silence, the Victorians slept according to the invisible laws of the planet. The windows, too, had rules. They must be opened a fraction, just enough to admit fresh air, but not so wide as to invite draught or rumor.
Air is purity, said the doctors, but excess is indiscretion. The balance between health and modesty was, as always, delicate. In these final acts, the brushing of hair, the folding of gown, the whisper to the maid, there was something touching in its precision. Each gesture seemed to say life, even in rest, must remain orderly. And perhaps that order was what allowed them to find peace not in freedom, but in form.
When the house had settled into its hush and only the clock ticked steadily from the hall, a softer ritual began, the communion between soul and silence. For the Victorians, prayer was not passion but posture. Each night they knelt beside their beds, not to plead but to preserve. Religion was the architecture of their morality, and bedtime the moment to maintain its symmetry. A woman's prayer might sound like a whisper to a distant father. "Grant me composure, grant me grace," she would murmur, her fingers resting on the lace edge of her pillow. A gentleman's prayer, meanwhile, was often practical. Gratitude for success, repentance for impropriety, and a request for endurance against temptation. They prayed not for miracles, but for manners. In homes where servants lived under the same roof, prayer was sometimes collective. Candles flickered in the small chapel or hallway, and the master's voice, measured, solemn, read from the Book of Common Prayer. The servants' heads bowed, shadows trembling across the walls. When the final Amen echoed, everyone dispersed silently, as if holiness itself required stillness. Then came the private moment that defined the Victorian conscience, the journal. Writing was not a release, but a duty of record. Each line must be neat, legible, restrained. The ink itself reflected the soul, dark, steady, controlled. It was expected that one write only facts, the weather, the visits, the meals, perhaps a remark on society, but never feelings. Emotion, they believed, had no place in ink. A surviving diary from 1871 begins with, "Breakfasted with the Stuarts, discussed rain," then continues, "Read Tennyson, avoided reflection." Between those lines, one can almost hear the silence, the heavy kind that fills when truth is held too tightly. Yet even in this repression, there was tenderness. Some left hidden codes in the margins, a small pressed flower for grief, a tiny cross for remorse, an ink smudge for affection never spoken. In their restraint, they found a secret poetry. One small story survives in the letters of a governess named Clara Moore. She wrote each night for 20 years without a single emotional confession. But after her death, her niece discovered one torn page. "Tonight, I smiled without reason. I fear I may be happy." That single sentence, trembling between rebellion and wonder, tells us more about the Victorian heart than any rule book could. Downstairs, the servants performed their last duties, folding gowns, refilling the wash basin, and trimming the wicks of oil lamps.
Each motion was part of the quiet machinery of propriety. Even water for the morning's wash had to be at the right temperature, placed precisely on the dressing table's right-hand side. Above them, in the bedrooms of their masters, ink dried beside half-burnt candles. The pages closed, the prayers ended. The house exhaled again, its heart steady in ritual. In that stillness, one could almost feel the century itself, measured, immaculate, holding its breath before dawn.
By the hour before midnight, the house had withdrawn into stillness so complete it seemed carved from time itself. Every ticking clock, every faint rustle of fabric became part of a symphony of rest. The air smelled faintly of linen, candle smoke, and lavender, the fragrance of Victorian sleep. Upstairs, the bedrooms glowed softly with the light of oil lamps turned low. The servants, having finished their duties, moved like ghosts through the hallways, closing shutters, checking locks, whispering their good nights. In the master's room, the candle flame fluttered one last time before the snuffer descended, a small silver cone extinguishing the day. To the Victorians, even darkness was a discipline. A lamp left burning too long was wasteful, even sinful, for it hinted at indulgence. They believed the night must be respected, not resisted. The flame's final sigh marked the boundary between action and surrender. In this dim world, husband and wife lay not together, but apart. Separate beds, sometimes separate rooms, a symbol of refinement rather than distance. Love was not expressed in touch, but in proximity, governed by decorum. Between them, silence became its own kind of intimacy. A gentleman might whisper, "Sleep well, my dear," and the lady reply, "And may angels keep thee," before both turn to face their own pillows, their breaths steady, their souls properly aligned with the north and south. Somewhere outside, a carriage passed, its wheels echoing softly over cobblestones, fading into the London mist. The city itself seemed to exhale. Behind thousands of curtained windows, the same ritual unfolded. Candles dimmed, nightcaps tied, hands folded in prayer. A civilization resting inside its own perfection. But if you listen closely to that fragile hush between the last candle flicker and the first dream, you might hear something else. Beneath the restraint, beneath the lace and iron, there is longing. Longing for the freedom to speak freely, to laugh too loudly, to live without performance. The Victorians never called it that, but perhaps in their polished hearts they felt it still. And yet, within their boundaries lay a strange beauty. To them, elegance was not wealth, but restraint. Virtue, not absence of desire, but mastery of it. In that sense, their discipline was its own kind of art. They lived as if the world itself were a fragile stage, and sleep the final bow. As you rest now, imagine that quiet house, the faint glow through embroidered curtains, the ticking of the clock,
the cool breath of midnight air. Picture the lace resting on the dressing table, the diary closed, the world in order. And as you close your eyes, may you inherit a piece of their stillness, measured, tender, unspoken. May you rest in peaceful slumber, dear listener, and may the night guard you gently, as it once guarded an age that dreamed in candlelight.